You crouch in tall yellow grass, watching an antelope graze 50 feet away. Your bow arm trembles slightly. Your arrowhead is small, thin, almost laughably weak against an animal that could outrun you, outlast you, and shrug off a wound that would kill a smaller creature. But you're not relying on the arrowhead. You're relying on what's smeared just below it. For most of human history, the deadliest part of a weapon wasn't its point. It was invisible. It was chemistry. And it solved a problem that simple sharpness never could. Think about the physics for a second. A human arm, even a strong one, can only put so much force behind a thin wooden shaft. Against a buffalo, an elephant, or a giraffe, a clean arrow wound usually isn't fatal on its own. The animal runs. It bleeds slowly. It might survive for days, dragging an arrow through territory you don't know, and weather you can't predict. For early hunters working in small bands, with no guns, no steel, and no margin for a multi-day chase across open terrain, that wasn't good enough. A wounded buffalo that escapes isn't a near miss. It's a lost meal, a wasted arrow, and possibly a furious animal circling back. So at some point, in more than one place on Earth, hunters stopped trying to make the weapon itself more powerful. They made the wound more powerful instead. Some of the oldest direct evidence for this idea comes from southern Africa. At Border Cave, on the border of South Africa and Eswatini, researchers Lucinda Backwell and Francesco Dirico examined a fragment of an ancient wooden applicator stick and found traces of ricinoleic acid, a compound that comes from castor bean plants and is still used today as a chemical marker for poison-based hunting kits. The residue dated back roughly 24,000 years. That's not a guess about ancient behavior, pieced together from imagination. That's a chemical fingerprint, left behind by a specific person, preparing a specific toxin, long before anyone anywhere on Earth had written a single word down. Not far away, at Sibudu Cave, archaeologist Marlise Lombard studied microscopic residues on stone-tipped arrowheads using high-powered microscopy. She found plant-based compounds consistent with poison use on points roughly the same age as the Border Cave find. Two separate sites, two separate research teams, working decades apart. The same conclusion, arrived at independently. Poison hunting in ancient Africa wasn't a rare trick, used once by one clever individual. It was a widespread, repeated, deliberate technology, refined over thousands of years. And it didn't stay confined to the past. In the Kalahari Desert, sand hunters were still using poison arrows well into the 20th century, and researcher Louis Liebenberg documented exactly how. They didn't rely on plants at all. They used insects, specifically the larvae of a beetle in the genus Diamphidia. Hunters would dig the larvae out of the soil near specific host plants, crush them between two stones, and apply the resulting toxic paste to the arrow shaft just below the head, never on the tip itself. That detail matters. Why not coat the very point of the arrow where it actually enters the body? Because the point is what touches the meat. If the poison sat directly on the tip, it would contaminate the wound site and the flesh around it during butchering, ruining exactly the resource the hunt was for in the first place. By placing it lower on the shaft instead, the toxin gets carried into the bloodstream as the arrow works deeper into muscle, while the area hunters actually cut into for food stays untouched. This wasn't trial and error luck. This was generations of careful, repeated observation, refined into a system precise enough to separate a lethal compound from a food source by a matter of inches. The toxin itself targets the heart. It interferes with the electrical signals that keep cardiac muscle beating in rhythm. A wound that might otherwise just slow an animal down instead stops its heart from working correctly. Slowly, reliably. From a weapon a child could lift and carry for miles. Halfway across the world, in the Amazon rainforest, a completely different group of hunters arrived at a strikingly similar idea, using completely different ingredients, with zero contact between the two cultures. Indigenous communities prepared a substance now known by its anglicized name, Curare, by boiling down the bark and vines of plants like Strychnos toxifera and Chondrodendron tomentosum for hours over a fire, reducing the liquid into a thick, dark paste used to coat the tips of blow darts. The American botanist Richard Evans Schultes spent years living among Amazonian communities documenting exactly which plants were used, how the knowledge was tested, and how it was passed down, plant by plant, recipe by recipe, through oral tradition rather than written record, often guarded as some of a community's most valuable knowledge. Curare works differently than the beetle larvae toxin used in the Kalahari. Instead of disrupting the heart's rhythm, it blocks the signal passing between nerves and muscles. A monkey struck by a Curare-tipped dart doesn't bleed out or convulse. Its muscles simply stop responding to its own brain, including, eventually, the muscles needed to breathe. The animal falls from the canopy not because of trauma, but because its body quietly stopped listening. Even ancient written history hints at this same pattern repeating itself in places researchers can't excavate directly. Greek writers, including Aristotle and Eshpert, later Pliny the Elder, described the Scythians, nomadic horse-riding peoples of the Eurasian steppe, preparing a substance for their arrows that classical sources refer to as scythicon, reportedly combining venom with decomposing matter into something potent enough to alarm the Greeks who wrote about it. We don't have a residue sample from a Scythian arrowhead the way we do from Border Cave. What we have instead is something almost as compelling. Outside observers, writing in a completely different language, on a completely different continent, independently recording that a group of horse warriors had turned the exact same idea into a weapon. In East Africa, hunters used yet another strategy, derived from a flowering shrub called Acocanthere, sometimes called the poison arrow plant for exactly this reason. Its sap contains compounds that disrupt the heart's rhythm in a way chemically related to substances modern medicine still studies for their effects on cardiac muscle. Hunters across parts of Kenya and Tanzania used it specifically for animals too large and too dangerous to approach safely a second time. One shot, one retreat, one long, patient wait, sometimes for hours, while the chemistry finished what the arrow had started. Notice what all of these groups have in common, even though none of them ever met. None of them needed the poison to act instantly. A fast-acting toxin would actually be less useful in most of these situations, because a panicked animal can run a surprising distance in just a few seconds of full adrenaline. What these hunters wanted instead was something slower, something that let an animal calm down, wander, and eventually collapse close enough to track on foot. The poison wasn't designed to be as violent as possible. It was designed to be efficient. That's a very different kind of intelligence than the one we usually picture when we picture primitive weapons. So picture the full scene now, reconstructed from these scattered fragments of evidence, separated by continents and tens of thousands of years. A hunter crouches in grass identical to the grass you imagined at the very start of this video. Their toolkit isn't a single weapon. It's two separate systems working together. A delivery mechanism, the bow or the blowgun, simple, replaceable, almost an afterthought. And a payload, the toxin itself, the result of years of accumulated knowledge about which beetle, which bark, which sap actually works, and which one will just make an animal sick for an afternoon and nothing more. The bow gets the arrow there. The chemistry finishes the job, long after the hunter has already slipped quietly away. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This wasn't crude. It wasn't desperate improvisation by people without better options. It was applied biochemistry, performed without laboratories, without written notation, and without any concept of what a nerve cell or heart muscle actually was at the cellular level. Hunters couldn't explain why Curare stopped breathing or why diamphidia toxin stopped a heart mid-beat. They didn't need to. They only needed centuries of careful, repeated observation passed from one generation to the next, refined until the dosage, the application point, and the preparation method were dialed in with genuine precision. And the story doesn't end in prehistory. Curare itself eventually made its way into modern medicine. A purified derivative called tubocurarine became one of the first muscle relaxants used in surgical anesthesia during the 20th century, helping surgeons keep a patient's muscles still during operations. The same basic chemical principle that Amazonian hunters used to bring down prey from the treetops was later isolated and refined by pharmacologists, then used to save lives on an operating table instead of ending them in a forest canopy. The poison and the medicine were never really two different things. They were always a matter of dose, intent, and control. That's really the twist hiding underneath this whole story. We tend to imagine ancient humans as having weaker tools than us, simpler tools, blunter solutions to old problems. But poison hunting flips that assumption upside down completely. It wasn't a workaround for a lack of technology. It was a sophisticated, multi-generational research project run entirely through observation, memory, and oral teaching, with results precise enough that some of its discoveries are still influencing medicine today, on different continents, in languages those original hunters never spoke. You don't hunt antelope with poison arrows. You probably never will. But you live every single day surrounded by the same basic principle those hunters understood instinctively, that the most powerful tools are always the ones with the most visible force behind them. A loud argument doesn't always win. A forceful first impression doesn't always last. Sometimes the real power is in something quiet, something invisible, something that simply needs time and patience to finish what a small, simple action already started, whether that's a sentence said calmly, a habit repeated daily, or a single decision whose effects you won't actually see for years. You crouch in tall yellow grass, watching an antelope graze 50 feet away. Your bow arm trembles slightly, but this time you understand exactly what you're really holding. Not a weapon, a formula. One that took your species tens of thousands of years, on multiple continents, working completely independently to perfect, chew on, refine, and eventually, without anyone planning it, hand off to the operating rooms of the modern world.